April 1944. A chill wind cut through the streets of London, carrying the distant echo of air raid sirens. Inside a shadowed townhouse near Victoria, a man paused, adjusting his coat and glancing nervously over his shoulder. He was a German spy, trained for precision, fluent in the language and manners of the city. For months he had moved unseen, delivering reports, transmitting secrets, and believing himself invisible. But tonight, the illusion shattered. The door burst open. British counterintelligence officers stormed in, flashlights cutting across walls lined with coded documents and hidden radio transmitters. His heart hammered as realization struck. The very city he had considered a foreign theater was the center of a web he could not escape. Every document, every message he had sent, had already been intercepted, decoded, and analyzed. Unknown to him, his operations had betrayed far more than he knew. Across Europe, deep inside Berlin, American and Allied intelligence had already infiltrated layers of German command. In that moment, the spy understood the truth. The war of shadows he had fought was over, and he had arrived too late to stop what was already happening. By 1943, the Second World War had evolved beyond battlefields and bombers. A quieter, deadlier war raged in shadows in city streets, offices, and silent rooms. The War of Intelligence. Britain and America had built vast networks to intercept communications, plant agents, and anticipate German movements. London, in particular, had become the nerve center of this silent battlefield. The British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and the Special Operations Executive, SOE, coordinated with the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, in Washington, exchanging intercepted communications. Double agents and cryptographic breakthroughs, spies moved through cities with coded messages, false identities, and invisible ink. Dead drops were hidden beneath park benches in hollowed-out bricks and inside innocuous mail. Every gesture, every meeting was a potential trap. Germany, meanwhile, had invested heavily in its intelligence apparatus. The Abwehr, under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and the SS's Sicherheitsdienst, SD, sought to infiltrate Allied capitals, uncover plans for invasions, and sabotage operations. Agents were trained in subtlety, fluent in local languages, and expected to move undetected through foreign streets. They were confident in their craft, believing the Allies' intelligence capabilities to be fragmented and slow. Yet the war was turning in favor of the Allies. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had already deciphered vast portions of Enigma encrypted communications, exposing German plans months in advance. Signals intelligence, combined with human sources, allowed London and Washington to monitor German espionage with increasing precision. Many German agents, operating under the assumption of secrecy, were feeding information directly into Allied hands. For the captured spy, these months of careful movements had been a facade. Every coded message he had transmitted had already been intercepted. Every rendezvous, every dead drop was known to the counterintelligence officers who were quietly mapping the web of spies across Europe. The sense of invisibility, the belief that he could act without detection, was about to collapse in an instant. London itself had become a trap disguised as a sanctuary. The city thrummed with activity, couriers crossing streets with messages concealed in newspapers, hidden radios transmitting faint Morse code signals, and analysts poring over intercepted German communications. To a trained spy, this was ordinary, procedural, yet it concealed a lethal truth. Allied intelligence was already several steps ahead, and Berlin, the command heart of the Reich, was more exposed than German commanders could imagine. Germany's spy network relied on assumptions of secrecy and superiority, but the Allies had learned to exploit its weaknesses. Surveillance, double agents, and sophisticated cryptanalysis meant that operations which seemed invisible to German eyes were actually fully illuminated in London and Washington. The intelligence war was no longer one of chance. It was a calculated, multi-layered assault on Germany's ability to conceal its intentions. The spy's arrest was not a sudden discovery, but the culmination of months of preparation. Officers had tracked movements, confirmed identities, and patiently waited for the moment to intervene. When the door finally burst open in April 1944, it was not luck but the result of meticulous, patient, and technologically advanced intelligence work. The scene in London represented more than a single capture. It was a microcosm of a broader reality. German intelligence, confident and methodical, had underestimated the Allies' reach. The spy, trained to deceive and evade, had unknowingly participated in a war already lost. A war waged not with bombs or bullets, but with data, observation, and the quiet patience of unseen adversaries. By the time officers led him away, the truth had already dawned. His actions, though seemingly impactful, had played into a much larger narrative. Berlin, the heart of the Reich, was already compromised. The Allies were inside its defenses, shaping the course of events long before German commanders could respond. The spy's arrest in London, therefore, was both an ending and a revelation. It marked the moment when Germany's illusions collided with reality, setting the stage for the deeper infiltration that would follow. By mid-1944, Berlin was a city of tension and contradiction. On its streets, life continued under a veneer of normalcy. Trams rattled along crowded avenues, workers hurried to factories, and propaganda posters proclaimed the Reich's strength. Beneath this surface, however, a silent war was underway, one that German commanders largely ignored. The Allies, particularly the OSS and MI6, had already established deep networks within Berlin. Agents, informants, and double operatives moved through ministries, military offices, and even high-ranking circles. Coded messages traveled through innocuous channels, letters, newspapers, and diplomatic pouches. Every intercepted communication revealed more about German troop movements, armaments, and strategic plans than German leaders suspected. Berlin's counterintelligence apparatus, including the Gestapo and the Sicherheitsdienst, believed their internal security was impenetrable. Officers trusted loyalty oaths and the fear of punishment to maintain secrecy. Yet their assumptions proved fatal. Allied operatives exploited personal connections, bribed clerks, and tapped into bureaucratic complacency. They moved unseen, embedding themselves in the very structures designed to protect the Reich. Signals intelligence compounded the vulnerability. Radio intercepts from London and Washington allowed the Allies to triangulate German communications, identify active networks, and preempt operations. By the time a German agent transmitted critical information back to Berlin, London had already decrypted it, analyzed it, and passed it on to commanders in both Washington and London. The Reich's belief in information security was a dangerous illusion. The spy arrested in London had operated under the assumption that Berlin was insulated, that messages would arrive unseen and unaltered. In reality, every report he had compiled had already been dissected, cross-referenced, and mapped. Officers in Berlin were unaware that the enemy had knowledge of their internal movements, that American and British operatives had penetrated layers of command and bureaucracy. High-ranking German leaders, including Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, were absorbed in the war's visible fronts: armies, air campaigns, and territorial defense. The concept that Allied intelligence could operate so deeply inside their capital was unfathomable. They underestimated both the sophistication and the audacity of American operations. Berlin, a city of power and paranoia, had become a labyrinth, with the Allies navigating every corridor unnoticed. By late 1944, the consequences of this infiltration were tangible. Military plans were compromised before execution. Supply lines were anticipated and disrupted. Key officers were unknowingly maneuvered into traps through intelligence leaks. The Allies' growing dominance in espionage eroded German operational security far more than bombs or artillery could. For the spy, the realization came too late. Arrested in London, he could only comprehend the scale of penetration. America was already inside Berlin. Operations he believed critical had been anticipated, and networks he thought secure had been observed for months. The Reich's nerve center, long assumed to be a fortress of secrecy, was already under surveillance and manipulation by the very enemies it sought to deceive. This deep infiltration would have profound consequences. German planners, blind to the reach of Allied intelligence, continued operations based on incomplete and misleading information. As a result, strategic decisions were flawed, morale within command structures faltered, and the gap between perceived control and actual vulnerability widened. The spy's capture was merely the visible tip of a much larger intelligence success. The streets of Berlin, with their ornate facades and bustling activity, hid a truth invisible to most. The war's outcome was being shaped not only by battles and bombardments but by shadows, codes, and the quiet, relentless work of Allied agents. When the spy finally understood his role, too late, he recognized that the war inside Berlin had already been lost, and that the enemies he had feared were already controlling the flow of information, anticipation, and strategy within the heart of the Reich. Espionage is a profession of constant tension, isolation, and risk. The German spy in London moved through the city like a shadow, blending into crowds, attending meetings, and delivering messages with precise care. Every step carried the weight of discovery. Every misstep could mean capture or death. For months, he believed himself invisible. Confidence was built on training, secrecy, and the assumption that British counterintelligence was fallible. Yet beneath this outward calm, anxiety gnawed. Sleep was fitful, punctuated by dreams of betrayal or sudden exposure. He relied on small routines, memorized codes, hidden compartments, and silent signals with handlers. These habits became rituals, protective talismans against the ever-present danger of detection. The arrest shattered that illusion. In the flash of torches and the sudden entry of officers, the spy realized that months of careful work had already been anticipated. Panic, fear, and disbelief surged, emotions sharpened by the knowledge that his efforts had inadvertently aided the enemy. Human vulnerability, the intersection of courage and error, had dictated the course of the war even before bullets were fired or bombs dropped. Intelligence operations were wars within wars. Dead drops in parks, clandestine meetings in crowded cafes, and the use of innocuous objects, hollowed coins, newspapers, or fountain pens, were all tactical tools. German agents relied on these methods to communicate with Berlin, assuming the chain of command was secure. Yet Allied counterintelligence had adapted. Operations were monitored through observation posts, surveillance of known operatives, and the use of double agents. London became a chessboard. Spies moved as pawns, handlers as rooks, and counterintelligence as the queen, controlling every visible and hidden square. Each intercepted message, each observed rendezvous, translated into actionable intelligence. German tactics, once considered sophisticated, proved predictable when confronted by meticulous observation, pattern recognition, and a relentless focus on eliminating unknown variables. The spy's arrest was the culmination of tactical patience. British officers waited, analyzed patterns, and acted only when success was certain. This approach minimized risk and maximized impact, demonstrating that espionage relied not just on courage, but on strategic precision. The same principles applied on battlefields, now transposed into city streets and shadowed offices. Technology amplified the human and tactical dimensions of intelligence. Radio transmitters, though small and concealable, emitted signals detectable by Allied listening stations. Ciphers, once thought unbreakable, were routinely decrypted at Bletchley Park. Every message sent by the German spy could be intercepted, decoded, and analyzed within hours, providing insight far beyond what the Reich imagined. Devices were simple in appearance: handheld radios, coded typewriters, and microfilm, yet they enabled the transfer of critical information. To the spy, these tools were lifelines, yet to the Allies they were the key to unraveling entire networks. Signals intelligence allowed British and American officers to predict operations, manipulate German planning, and preempt sabotage. In essence, technology converted human actions into a visible pattern that could be exploited, turning the spy's careful work into a weapon against him. Even when the spy believed he had erased traces of communication, hidden monitoring stations had already logged movements, transmissions, and anomalies. The Allies' combination of human intelligence and technological surveillance created a system in which German operations, no matter how covert, could not escape scrutiny. The convergence of human effort, tactical design, and technological oversight rendered secrecy nearly impossible, a fact that the spy discovered too late. Within London and across Europe, the War of Shadows had already tipped in favor of the Allies. Human courage, tactical ingenuity, and technological mastery had penetrated Berlin's defenses without detection. Yet the story was far from complete. Leadership decisions, moral dilemmas, and the larger strategic consequences of espionage would soon converge, revealing how deeply the Reich had already been compromised. Berlin's leadership operated under a dangerous illusion. Hitler, Himmler, Goering, and other senior officials believed that German counterintelligence could contain the threat of Allied spies. Meetings were held with an air of confidence. Directives were issued assuming the flow of information was secure. But beneath this veneer, Allied operatives had already infiltrated multiple layers of command. American intelligence, coordinated by Allen Dulles and the OSS, had agents embedded in ministries, military offices, and communication hubs. Decisions made in Berlin were influenced by data collected and transmitted months earlier. Strategic choices, troop movements, and supply distributions were no longer entirely under German control. Leaders acted on information they assumed was secret, yet in reality, the enemy had already anticipated their moves. The capture of the spy in London revealed just how fragile command had become. Officers realized that operations considered critical to the Reich's war effort had been compromised, and decisions had been rendered ineffective before execution. Leadership, once a pillar of strength, was now operating blind in a battlefield defined by intelligence rather than conventional arms. Espionage is inherently a moral labyrinth. Agents risked lives, civilians were often caught in webs of deceit, and operations sometimes exploited trust and loyalty. The German spy, though trained for precision, had unwittingly facilitated the Allies' deeper penetration. His capture highlighted the human cost: loyalty misapplied, courage rendered futile, and the crushing weight of knowledge realized too late. Civilians in Berlin, unaware of the intelligence war raging beneath their daily lives, were often collateral participants. Letters intercepted, phone lines tapped, and clandestine meetings surveilled blurred the line between combatant and bystander. The moral calculus of espionage, who suffers, who benefits, was starkly visible in this network. The spies' realization that America was already inside Berlin underscored that in intelligence, human lives were the ultimate instruments in stakes. The deeper significance of Allied infiltration cannot be overstated. By 1944, Berlin was no longer an isolated command center. It had become a theater of observation and manipulation. Allied intelligence had penetrated every conceivable layer: administrative offices, military command, communications hubs, and even cultural institutions. The information gathered reshaped operational planning, forced Germany into reactive strategies, and rendered many of its calculations obsolete. This depth of infiltration meant that the Reich's apparent control over its war efforts was largely illusory. Field operations depended on directives originating from compromised intelligence channels. Decisions that seemed precise were in fact predictable. The spy's arrest in London merely confirmed a larger reality. Berlin was vulnerable not because of bombs or tanks, but because the Allies had already entered its mind. For the spy, the realization that the Allies were deeply embedded in Berlin was psychologically devastating. Months of meticulous work, careful planning, and personal risk had been neutralized by superior intelligence operations. Fear, shame, and disbelief collided as he understood that he had been operating in a city already illuminated by enemy observation. This psychological impact extended beyond the captured spy. German commanders, unaware of the depth of infiltration, began making decisions under the false assumption of secrecy. The mismatch between perception and reality eroded confidence, fostered paranoia, and contributed to mistakes that would further compromise German operations. The mental game of espionage, as much as the tactical or technological, had shifted irreversibly in favor of the Allies. By late 1944, the intelligence war had set the stage for decisive action. The Reich, believing it maintained control, was in fact exposed to manipulation and disruption at every level. The arrest of a single spy in London illuminated a much broader truth. America and its allies had already secured positions of influence deep inside Berlin, shaping the war from within. April 1944, London. The German spy, now in custody, sat under the harsh glare of interrogation lamps. Every document in his possession had already been examined. Every code he had sent carefully decrypted. Slowly, the realization struck him. His mission had been a shadow dance on a stage already illuminated by Allied eyes. The carefully cultivated illusion of secrecy had vanished. Meanwhile, deep inside Berlin, the consequences of his capture began to ripple. Officers in the Abwehr and SD received reports of compromised agents. Routes once considered secure were exposed. Dead drops had been monitored, communications intercepted, and meetings recorded. For the first time, the Reich's internal intelligence structures faced the stark truth. The Allies were operating within their walls, unseen yet fully informed. German commanders had assumed the city remained impenetrable. The SS and Gestapo trusted loyalty, fear, and secrecy to protect their operations, but the spies' arrest confirmed months of invisible work by OSS and MI6 agents. Reports flowed into Washington and London. American and British operatives had not only infiltrated Berlin, but had positioned themselves strategically within ministries, factories, and communication hubs. Decisions in the Reich were being influenced before they were even executed. The spy's knowledge, once considered a strategic advantage, had become a liability. Every action he had undertaken, every coded transmission, every clandestine meeting, had been anticipated. The network he had helped sustain was already compromised, and the depth of Allied penetration exceeded anything he had imagined. Signals intelligence amplified the impact. Radio transmissions from Berlin, though encrypted, had been routinely monitored. Deadly combinations of human observation and technical interception allowed Allied analysts to reconstruct networks and anticipate German responses. The spy had operated under the assumption that his radio signals were secret. In reality, each pulse had been recorded, analyzed, and transformed into actionable intelligence against Berlin itself. Across the city, minor disruptions began to appear. Officers found documents missing, memos altered, and trusted clerks behaving strangely. Panic, subtle at first, began to take root. Berlin, the nerve center of the Reich, was no longer fully in German hands, not physically but cognitively. Decisions made in confidence were vulnerable to manipulation and preemption. In London, interrogators extracted information from the spy with a calm precision that mirrored operations in Berlin. Each revelation was cross-checked against intercepted communications and human intelligence, confirming what had long been suspected. The Allies had achieved an unprecedented level of infiltration. The spy's personal realization was mirrored by a systemic one. German counterintelligence, once confident and comprehensive, faced a silent collapse. Networks that were thought secure were compromised, plans that were considered secret were exposed, and command decisions relied increasingly on assumptions rather than verified information. The war within the shadows was being lost before a single shot had been fired in this theater. The impact extended beyond Berlin. German military planners, unaware of the depth of Allied penetration, continued to deploy resources and assign tasks as though their operations remained confidential. Field units received directives based on flawed assumptions. Strategic decisions became reactive, vulnerable to manipulation. The spy's arrest was a visible marker of a larger truth. America and Britain were already inside the city, shaping outcomes from within, and the Reich's illusions of control were crumbling. The night air in London felt different as the spy realized the scope of his failure. His entire career, his months of clandestine activity, had inadvertently contributed to a war already tilted against his homeland. Every map, every schedule, every communication he had trusted was now part of the Allies' blueprint for dismantling the Reich from the inside. By the end of April, the pattern was undeniable. German counterintelligence, once a structured and feared apparatus, was now reactive and fragmented. Officers operated with incomplete data, underestimating the Allies' reach and overestimating their own security. The capture of a single agent in London revealed the depth of systemic compromise. Berlin, the symbolic heart of Nazi Germany, was no longer the impenetrable fortress it appeared to be. May 1944. Berlin's streets buzzed with ordinary life. Yet beneath the surface, the city was unraveling. Allied intelligence had penetrated offices, ministries, and military command structures. Reports flowed invisibly to London and Washington, providing insight into troop movements, supply lines, and strategic planning. German leaders, still convinced of their city's security, remained unaware that the war was being fought beneath their noses. The capture of the German spy in London acted as a keystone. His documents, radio equipment, and coded messages confirmed a network already compromised. Every agent, every communication route he had relied upon had been observed, decrypted, or repurposed by Allied counterintelligence. The Reich's assumption of secrecy crumbled as officers recognized the depth of infiltration. Within Berlin, confusion spread. Abwehr officers questioned loyalties, Gestapo operatives grew paranoid, and security protocols were hastily revised, often too late. Trusted clerks and bureaucrats were interrogated, rooms were searched, coded messages were reissued, yet the Allies were already one step ahead. Intelligence from London allowed them to anticipate these reactions, feeding on the Reich's attempts to regain control. High-level German planning was now reactive rather than proactive. Strategies intended to fortify the Reich became predictable, and Allied operatives inside Berlin could manipulate information flows. Troop deployments, equipment shipments, and internal communications were compromised long before decisions reached the battlefield. The illusion of command was shattered. The spies' realization that America and Britain had already infiltrated Berlin was mirrored by a growing recognition among German officers that operational security was no longer guaranteed. Critical projects, from V-weapon development to counterintelligence operations, were now vulnerable to manipulation and interception. Berlin's nerve center had become a theater of observation, with the Allies controlling the flow of information and, by extension, influence over decisions made by German command. Psychologically, the blow was profound. Confidence among German intelligence officers eroded as they understood that even minor missteps could be exploited. Paranoia replaced certainty. Fear of betrayal became a daily companion. Entire divisions of spies were rendered ineffective, as communication channels were compromised and networks disrupted. The war within Berlin was being won before a single artillery shell was fired. By mid-May, the systemic impact was undeniable. The Reich's leadership faced delayed operations, flawed intelligence, and internal distrust. Hitler's directives issued in confidence were increasingly based on incomplete or misleading data. The spies' capture in London had exposed not just an isolated failure, but the vulnerability of Berlin's entire intelligence architecture. American and British operatives, now firmly embedded, continued to feed actionable intelligence to command centers abroad. Operations that German officers considered secure were already anticipated, neutralized, or redirected. The Allies' ability to influence the flow of information inside Berlin had shifted the strategic balance. Every plan, every directive was now filtered through a lens the Germans could neither detect nor counter effectively. By the end of May 1944, Berlin's intelligence networks were in disarray. The spies' arrest was a dramatic symbol of systemic failure, but it also marked a turning point in the shadow war. The city, once thought invulnerable, had been breached at multiple levels. German command could no longer rely on secrecy, nor could it act with confidence. America and Britain had established an invisible presence within Berlin that would shape the final months of the war. In that convergence of human error, technological superiority, and meticulous intelligence work, the Allies achieved a decisive victory within the heart of the Reich. The spy, once confident and skilled, realized too late that the war was no longer fought solely on the battlefield. It had already been won in shadows, codes, and unseen corridors. By June 1944, the impact of the spies' capture in London reverberated across German intelligence networks. Agents once considered reliable were now under suspicion. Dead drops were abandoned or destroyed. Ciphers were changed, yet the Allies already possessed a map of the communication lines and personnel involved. The Reich's once cohesive intelligence web had begun to unravel from within. Captured agents faced harsh interrogations. Some, unaware of the full scope of Allied penetration, confessed critical details under pressure. Others remained silent, their training and resolve tested to the brink. Regardless, the net result was clear. Networks throughout Western Europe and within Berlin were compromised. Commands sent from Berlin were increasingly misinformed, delayed, or intercepted, reducing operational efficiency across multiple theaters. London's counterintelligence services emerged with unprecedented credibility. The MI6 SOE and OSS had coordinated months of surveillance, tracking agents, intercepting messages, and preparing the moment of intervention. The arrest of a single spy was not an isolated event, but the culmination of systematic, patient work, a testament to planning, technical skill, and human perseverance. The psychological impact on German intelligence officers was immediate. Paranoia grew within the Abwehr and SD. Loyalty became suspect, routine protocols were questioned, and officers feared that any misstep could expose operations further. Efficiency declined as hesitation replaced decisiveness. Confidence in their ability to safeguard Berlin and the Reich's critical communications eroded. Operationally, the Allies gained more than just intelligence. The capture provided direct insight into German procedures, safe houses, codebooks, and contacts. This allowed London and Washington to preempt sabotage, anticipate troop movements, and neutralize threats before they materialized. The Allies could act with precision, reducing uncertainty and amplifying the effectiveness of subsequent operations. For Berlin, the implications were profound. The city's command structure was compromised even as leaders remained unaware. Hitler and his inner circle continued to operate under the assumption that their intelligence networks were intact. Decisions made on faulty premises exposed vulnerabilities in troop deployments, resource allocations, and strategic planning. The capture in London revealed that the enemy's influence had already reached into the city's administrative heart, shaping outcomes in ways the Reich could neither detect nor prevent. Civilians, too, experienced indirect consequences. Espionage operations often intersected with daily life. Clerks, postal workers, and civil servants became unwitting participants in a war of observation. Suspicion, searches, and arrests disrupted routines and sowed fear. In some cases, the Allies leveraged civilian channels to gather additional intelligence, highlighting the complex human web involved in this hidden battlefield. The arrest also sent a message to other agents. German operatives in occupied Europe were forced to reconsider their security and loyalty. Networks had to be restructured, operations delayed, and communications rerouted. Yet even these measures could not fully compensate for the knowledge the Allies had already gained. The depth of infiltration meant that any remaining German efforts were continually anticipated, often nullifying their intended impact. By mid-1944, it was clear the spies' capture represented more than a tactical success. It symbolized a turning point in the war of intelligence. The Allies had established a position of dominance inside Berlin, undermining German command and control. From London, Washington, and other Allied centers, the flow of information, decisions, and strategic insight could now reach Berlin faster than the Reich's own internal processes. The collapse of German networks marked the beginning of an accelerated Allied advantage. What had begun as a single arrest rippled outward, weakening operational cohesion, undermining morale, and exposing systemic vulnerabilities. For Berlin, and for the Reich's broader intelligence efforts, the Shadow War had decisively shifted in favor of the Allies. By July 1944, the consequences of Allied infiltration were fully apparent. Berlin, long considered the nerve center of the Reich, had been penetrated at multiple levels. Intelligence that should have been secret was now a tool in Allied hands. Troop movements, armament production, and critical decisions were no longer isolated from enemy observation. The capture of a single spy in London had revealed a systemic vulnerability, exposing the Reich's command structure to manipulation and disruption. German leaders, still unaware of the full extent of the compromise, faced increasing operational confusion. Orders were delayed or misinterpreted. Supply lines became inconsistent, and plans intended to fortify defenses often fell short. Hitler's faith in the secrecy of Berlin's intelligence apparatus was misplaced, leaving him reliant on flawed or incomplete information. The illusion of control masked the reality. The Allies had already gained an invisible advantage, shaping decisions before they were executed. Psychologically, the impact on German intelligence officers was profound. Suspicion and paranoia became dominant forces in decision-making. The Gestapo and Abwehr scrutinized every subordinate, fearing betrayal and leaks. Morale faltered as even experienced operatives realized that months of careful work had been anticipated or countered. The arrest in London had initiated a chain reaction, undermining confidence across multiple departments and creating uncertainty at every level of command. Meanwhile, Allied agencies capitalized on this advantage. The OSS and MI6, coordinating with Bletchley Park cryptographers, exploited the compromised networks to preempt sabotage, redirect German resources, and protect key Allied operations in occupied Europe. Every piece of intelligence obtained through infiltrated networks became a force multiplier, allowing Allied forces to operate with precision and foresight. Berlin's leadership remained largely blind to the scale and depth of these operations, rendering them increasingly reactive rather than proactive. The long-term strategic consequences were significant. By mid-1944, Berlin was no longer a fortress of secrecy, but a city under observation. Operational security was a myth. Every plan risked exposure. Every communication risked interception. This invisibility of the Allies within the Reich not only disrupted immediate operations but also accelerated Germany's strategic decline. Military initiatives were compromised before they could take effect, undermining confidence in leadership and eroding the efficiency of an already strained war machine. For civilians, the ramifications were subtle but real. The intertwining of espionage with daily life meant that ordinary citizens occasionally became conduits, witnesses, or inadvertent participants in intelligence operations. Postal workers, clerks, and municipal employees unknowingly interacted with compromised networks. The psychological atmosphere of suspicion, surveillance, and uncertainty extended beyond military personnel into the broader urban fabric of Berlin. By late 1944, the combined effects of infiltration, compromised communication, and operational misjudgment made it clear that the Reich's position was untenable. The Allies operating from London and Washington had effectively placed themselves inside Berlin, dictating the rhythm of intelligence and strategic foresight. The city's leadership, unable to perceive this invisible occupation, continued to make decisions based on an illusion of control. The spies' arrest in London, initially a single tactical victory, thus revealed a systemic failure that reshaped the trajectory of the war. German command structures were weakened, operational confidence eroded, and the Allies' capacity to shape events from within Berlin became an irreversible advantage. The Shadow War had been won. The capture of a single German spy in London was more than an isolated event. It was a revelation of how war had evolved beyond guns and bombs. Berlin, the heart of the Reich, had been penetrated long before the spy realized it, demonstrating that victory in modern conflict often comes not through force, but through knowledge, patience, and human ingenuity. Espionage, with its coded messages, dead drops, and clandestine meetings, transformed ordinary individuals into instruments of history. The German spy, trained to deceive and evade, became a silent witness to his own failure. Each transmission he believed secure had already been intercepted. Each plan he thought secret had already been anticipated. The human cost of this shadow war was profound. Courage, loyalty, and risk were rendered meaningless in the face of superior strategy and technological advantage. For the Allies, the operation exemplified the power of foresight. The OSS, MI6, and Bletchley Park cryptographers had orchestrated months of careful observation, infiltration, and analysis. Their success did not depend on dramatic confrontations, but on meticulous planning, patience, and precision. From London to Washington, from hidden rooms to intercepted transmissions, the Allies had achieved a form of influence that no battlefield could rival. Berlin, once considered impenetrable, had become a stage upon which intelligence dictated outcomes long before armies engaged in combat. German leaders, operating under illusions of secrecy, made decisions that were already anticipated, manipulated, or neutralized. The war within shadows had already determined the rhythm of events, shaping the Reich's decline without a single visible sign of intervention. Ultimately, the story of espionage in Berlin illustrates the quiet yet decisive power of knowledge. Victory was not only a matter of strength or numbers, but of insight, patience, and the courage to act unseen. The spy's realization, though too late, reminds us that in history, as in life, outcomes are often shaped far from the spotlight in hidden corridors, coded messages, and the silent determination of those who work in the shadows. The invisible war had already been won, and in that truth lies a lesson for history, strategy, and humanity. The greatest victories are often those we never see, fought not with weapons but with foresight, intellect, and unwavering resolve.